What's up, guys? It's Lauren Egan here at the Bulwark. I have Rob Flaherty here with me today. He has a pretty long resume in Democratic politics, but you might know his name most recently because he was the digital director in the Biden White House before he moved over to the Biden campaign to be a deputy campaign manager. Of course, that turned into the Harris campaign. Rob, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me, Lauren, and hi, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I asked you to come and chat with us because you have an op-ed in the New York Times this week, and it's titled, "If you're a voter reading this essay is not about you." So give us the quick summary of this piece and what you're trying to argue in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I think if you look at why Democrats lost the election in 2024, there was a split between voters who pay attention, who Democrats are really good at communicating with through the traditional institutions of media, through a battle over facts, through a style that takes into account the values of our institutions and democracy and all of those things. And voters who don't pay attention, who feel the system isn't working for them, who feel burned by politics, and in a world of infinite media choices, don't need to hear the news, don't sort of need to hear about politics in their day-to-day. They aren't seeking it out. But that doesn't mean they're not getting information about politics. They're getting information from their friends, their family, from social media, from all the above. And so in order to successfully reach those voters, we need to adapt to a whole new style of tactics. We need to adapt to a bunch of stuff that we tried in 24 but didn't do enough of, things that the party has struggled with subsequently. But we also have to think about our style. I mean, at some fundamental level, these voters think we're full of shit and think that maybe we make a bunch of promises, but we never deliver. That the party is weak, and the shortest way to do that is to pick fights, drive conflict, drive attention, drive reach, and then ultimately have that drive votes. And so, in many ways, this is less a conversation about, what issue sets do you need to pick, and more, how do you get in front of these voters? How do you show that you really believe what you are saying? And how do you drive attention? Because that is ultimately the way that you reach these folks who are not normally paying attention to us.
So I just want to start off by addressing a bit of the elephant in the room. I totally agree with a lot of what you're arguing and writing in this piece. But why wasn't that that logic then applied to the Biden situation? Because I think everything that you write to me makes it even more apparent that maybe Biden should have never run for re-election in the first place and that he wasn't the right candidate or the person for this moment.
Well, I think part of the challenge is this is a struggle for pretty much any major Democratic candidate right now. I think this is like a stylistic adjustment that a lot of Democratic candidates need to make. I think you're seeing a lot of folks try to get their reps in right now, and do better in this sort of lane. But it's a challenge for a lot of people. In the case of the president, I think there's a lot of stuff that we had the president do to try to get in front of these voters. But it is sort of a fundamental challenge for him, as it was for a lot of folks, because, I think the sort of style of politics of the whole party is sort of not oriented towards, this sort of style of communicating. And so it's, the other sort of part of this too is I think this is a thing that the campaign identified. I mean, at the beginning of the campaign, we maybe even talked about it, we called them persuade to participate voters at the time, which was the sort of fundamental challenge for the campaign, which was even at the beginning, there was sort of a disaffected group of Democrats that both campaigns were going after. And so this is sort of a thing that we worked at, all throughout. I think, there were certainly things that the campaign should have done better in both the Biden era and the Harris era. And there were things the campaign did well in the Biden era and the Harris era to reach these folks. But, this is like a party-wide effort that, I think is going to, need to focus on reaching these folks.
There's a version of this where I think Democrats convince themselves that they can get their own version of these online platforms, or someone who can communicate really well on these platforms, and that's like a silver bullet. But I think that there's another argument that can be made that Democrats don't just need a Pete Buttigieg who can, go on a podcast and chat for 3 hours, but they need someone who can, moderate on various issues that matter to voters, that has credibility in that moderation on these issues. Do you think that the like moderation component is part of this at all?
To me, it's less about moderation or being progressive or any of that stuff, and it's more about sort of um, does it seem like you really believe what the heck you're saying, right? And so, like, I think
Like
there's
the authenticity thing
yeah,
that we keep talking about. Yeah.
and I think a lot of these voters give Bernie Sanders a lot of credit for believing what he says, even if they disagree with him. And so, like famously, I worked for Hillary Clinton. You know what I mean? Like I am not a Bernie guy, but I think that is a thing that like people give him credit on. And so I think, moderation, not moderation. I think ultimately the most important thing is like, does it seem like you're real and that your beliefs are strongly held? I think that the party overall needs to sort of look. We need more voters. I mean, that's the fundamental problem. And so, however you sort of build a candidate, a campaign, a movement that um, invites more people in and has a bigger tent, that is the most important thing. And I think there's a lot of different ways that you can pull that off, irrespective of your sort of positioning.
Yeah, and the bigger tent component is interesting because, you talk about going on, to more like non-traditional type platforms, and obviously like with Rogan, that was a big thing with Bernie going on there. And is that a place that Democrats should go given things that he says about trans issues? Do you think it's like the whole party kind of needs to relearn eh, how to operate in this media environment so that you don't have sort of like activists online, like, coming at you for doing something, going on a podcast like Rogan that might not sort of fit into this narrow box of how hardcore Democrats view themselves?
The fundamental thing is, I always say there are no broadcasts anymore. There's just narrowcasts, and so you have to go around collecting narrowcasts. I mean, that is the basic gist. And in the same way that campaigns traditionally go to different DMAs to reach folks in local media, we have to think about audiences that way. A small media engagement that reaches a certain audience is a valuable use of a candidate's time. And there's a lot of audiences you need to talk to, and places you need to go with people who may not agree with you on everything. I mean, that is just sort of the fundamental thing. And so, to me, there's no voter that the party can afford to write off. There is, we are in a place where, we are writing off states we used to win. I mean, that means we need to expand the tent. That means we need to expand the number of people we're talking to. And that does mean going to podcasts, or media appearances or radio shows or town halls with organizations, with people who might disagree with us. Because I think that the willingness to hear people out and engage with people we disagree with is how you win over people who don't agree with us. And in a world where there just aren't enough people to support a Democratic coalition in a presidential right now, like we need to do that.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me a bit of the obviously we've been talking a lot about Elon Musk recently, but it reminds me of the White House event that I think was in the summer of 2021. It was the electric vehicle event that Biden had at the White House, where he invited a bunch of EV companies. Notoriously, Elon Musk was not invited to this, which we know now from reporting really offended him. He was pretty upset about it. Does that make you, this whole conversation, does that make you rethink the decision to not invite someone like Musk to the White House for that type of event? If you need a big tent, the decision, I think, to not invite him was largely a disagree about Tesla's labor practices. But if you're trying to create a bigger tent, if you want to bring people like Musk, or people that follow Musk and like Musk, those kinds of potential voters into the fold, then maybe don't stiff arm one of like the biggest social media posters in the world. Like, if you could do that over again, do you think you do invite someone like Musk to an event like that?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't, that wasn't my project. Uh, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a difference between going and reaching people and inviting a, you know, red-pilled a billionaire to the White House. You know, you know, I don't.
He wasn't quite as red pilled at the time, I will say, but yes, it is since escalated, as we've all seen.
I think we knew where Elon was going.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't necessarily draw an equivalent on that end, but you know, I think going to platforms and places where people, you know, have differing opinions is a good thing. But you know, highlighting people who, you know, whose views you don't agree with is not necessarily a thing you have to do.
So then, what do you think of Gavin Newsom's podcast? And, you know, I think he's highlighted some people that fall into the red pill Musk category.
Yeah, look, you know, I think it is. I don't know that I am very long on politicians having their own podcasts. I would say that I would generally advise that it is better to go to other people's platforms than to have your own, because the people who are going to go to yours are generally the people who are interested in hearing from you. Now, that being said, more content is more content. That's a good thing, and however you're going to do it is good. You know, I don't really even take issue with having guests on that you disagree with. I mean, from both a from both the how do you get people to listen to a podcast perspective. I mean, that's like 101 stuff. but but like, you know, you do have to have those sort of conversations. You know, I will say you like you also probably should not be a like, if you're a politician not who's on a podcast, your job is to be to win the argument and not be sort of a passive podcast host. And that's sort of the trap that I think, you know, you sort of find yourself in if you're in these positions. But, you know, on balance, you know, it's you know, it's an interesting idea, but, you know, I don't know that it's the tactic I would recommend.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think one of the questions, or one of the things that I didn't understand about the Newsom question, and it kind of goes into this conversation too about like, should Democratic donors fund some more progressive media platforms? If the whole goal is to reach apolitical voters, or like what you're calling these opt-out voters, is that really a good use of resources? Isn't it just that like Democrats need to show up to these spaces that like aren't actually political places? Like Rogan and Theo Vaughn, you know, those are the obvious examples that people keep using. But do you think it's a good sort of, how are you thinking about what donors should spend money on in terms of creating different kinds of platforms? Is that really like a good use of resources, or an effective use of resources?
Yeah, look, I think there's like a couple of things here. It's sort of like a two-step, which is, you know, the right has spent years and years and years building up a desire, an appetite, a demand for alternative media, right? Because their voters, their audience don't trust the mainstream press. So they go, okay, well, I want the Daily Wire and I want these sort of online publications because they can. And so the right sort of backed themselves into a position where they built this sort of thriving ecosystem in the space where a lot of voters who don't trust the system are now. And so, you know, to that end, you know, you are seeing a lot of, you know, there is a desire online for alternative center left and left media and sort of, you know, I don't know, resistance media. I mean, you know, the Bulwark. Hello, we're here on the Bulwark YouTube.
Someone called us non-cringe resistance media, so I'm gonna go with that.
Take non-cringe resistance. That's right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, to me, you kind of have to do both things. The advantage of what this is for the right is they've got this big ecosystem that then sort of pushes up against the other parts of the internet and the other sort of parts, the other subcultures of the internet. And then they've also gone to those places, right? They've done, you know, everybody talks about the manosphere, fine, but they're also doing health and wellness. They're doing parenting. They're in all these other sort of corners of the universe. And so if I'm a donor and I'm funding stuff, I think the most important thing is to fund both a healthy sort of anti-Trump ecosystem, you know, pro-democracy, pro-social trust, you know, sort of pro-left, pro-Democrat, whatever media system, ecosystem. But then you also have to think about how are we funding the pipelines into, those other cultural spaces. The reality is a lot of these folks need to, we need to, it's not currently super profitable to be a liberal on the internet. And that is like a problem. But there are, we need to give people the room to sort of experiment, to exist there, to try the stuff that's going to, build an audience, and that's going to take some backing. And the right, it's not like the right, this just happened. I mean, this was a funded, capitalized exercise that then became profitable over time. And so, there's just got to be more of that.
Yeah. I mean, this question about how Democrats regain cultural relevance is so interesting. And it's such a big question. Like, what does that even look like? Is that like, building more relationships with influencers, or does it have to be like more organic than that?
Yeah. I mean, there's the technical stuff, right? There's, you've got to, um, reach people, show up in places, be authentic, like all the stuff, whatever. Um, I do think there's like a fundamental problem about the fact that we became the staunch defenders of the institution versus the improvers of the institution, which that's not like, I'm not like, that's going to make you culturally cool, because that's like kind of a wonky answer. But
So cool.
yeah, super cool to be but there is this element of it's become countercultural in a moment of counterculture to be conservative. And in a moment where people hate institutions, where the traditional institutions of society are falling away and distrusted, that the conservatism became the thing that is rebellious and fun. And that is the thing that I think is really missing, is sort of the party, the left. It became less fun. It became less interesting. It was, progressive without being inclusive in many ways. So that, I think, is the big sort of issue. We need to seem like a movement that you want to be a part of, that wants you to be a part of it. And that takes a level of irreverence, that takes a level of acknowledging where the system is failing people, and not falling into the America is already great trap. All of those things, I think, are, it's a branding exercise, as much as it is a technical exercise.
Make Democrats cool again. I guess that's the mission.
Yes. There will be, yeah. Nothing
yeah.
says we're cool than a hat.
Nothing says I'm so cool than
Yeah,
saying
exactly.
Make Democrats cool again.
Exactly.
That'll be a real wedding message for you guys. I'm curious then, your experience working for Biden and just everything that happened over the past 18 months, if that's influenced how important you feel like it is for Democrats to be effective communicators, and sort of like whoever emerges from this moment, whoever kind of is the nominee in 2028, whatever that looks like, that fundamentally one of the most important things to prioritize is this authenticity and this ability to communicate in all different spaces. Because I don't think that's a skill that every Democratic leader that's out there right now actually really has. So how are you thinking about the need to prioritize that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is a skill issue and a prioritization issue. I think that we have an issue across the board where, well, it's not even an issue across the board. I guess it's more that I think I always say it's objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. I think everyone has sort of a warped perception of the way the world consumes information, because everything is hyper personalized, right? And so everyone lives in their own little media bubbles. And so because of that, it's really easy to think that what you are seeing on the internet is what everyone else is seeing, what you are seeing on TV, how you are consuming media. I do think there is a fundamental thing that leaders who don't live in it cannot really understand understand it, right? You can't teach YouTube to someone who doesn't watch YouTube. You can't teach TikTok to people who don't watch TikTok. And so I do think there's like an element of, um, you know, political leaders being native to this stuff being really, really important.
So that sounds like it's an age thing in a way.
Well, I think it's a generational thing, but it's also like a style. Like, there are older politicians who are good at this. It's just sort of like it is an adaptable thing. You can learn it. But yeah, I mean, like there is an element of um, uh, if it's not a thing that you are constantly living in, you're never going to prioritize it in the same way. And so that is just a fundamental challenge. Um, and then, I do think there's sort of like the way we have drilled political figures for a really long time is, run out the clock, give your talking points, repeat your points, go back to your base answer, all that stuff. And like, there is just that doesn't work in these kinds of formats. You have to be able to have like a real conversation and like engage with questions on the substance and the merits. That is like a different kind of media training. That is like a completely different kind of existence for a lot of these folks. And so I think in some ways there's like a generational thing where, we definitely, this calls for a series of folks who are more versed in the media of the moment to be given positions of authority in both staff level and principal level. But then also we've got to sort of put our sort of rethink the way that we put our political figures out there and how do we get them ready for this.
It seems like there's been a bit of a reemergence of Biden-Harris rolled folks in the past few days. You're not the only Biden alum that's written a New York Times op-ed recently. Biden wrote something for USA Today this week about the Pope. Why do you think we're starting to hear from more Biden folks now? And do you think that, there's sort of going to be a bit of a reemergence from some of the folks from this last election in the coming days?
I can't speak for other folks. This is sort of a thing I've been thinking about for a while, and I've been working with the Times on it for a little bit, and the timing was now. I think there's a lot of important lessons that we learned in this election that are worth sharing out and worth having a conversation about. I think that's why I wrote it, and I'll let other folks speak for themselves.
You are going to absolutely hate that I'm bringing up this email that you wrote during the campaign, but you sent out a fundraising email poking fun at self-important podcasters. And, hindsight's 2020. Now that we know what we know about the media landscape, I'm curious if you regret using any of those words in that email.
Well, I think, look,
tensions were high at the time. I'll give you that. It was right after the debate.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, it was a strongly worded email. But the broader point was, at the time, the pathway forward was to rally our base and rally our people. And, that's what we were trying to do at the moment. I have lots of respect for those self-important podcasters.
Thank you. We appreciate your respect for the podcast industry here at the Bulwark. Thank you. Well, Rob, this was a super, super interesting op-ed. I really encourage our listeners to go and give it a read. And I hope you come back because I know you've got lots of thoughts about the future of the Democratic Party and how y'all navigate this brave new world of online media. So thanks for doing this and come back anytime.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Hey, YouTube fam. If you want to support the Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave.